So, good morning and welcome. If you've not heard already, my name's Kate. I'm the Senior Digital Marketing Manager here at MorePay. Today, we're going to be talking about the topic of tackling racism in the workplace from a business perspective and looking at discrimination types and how we can handle this. Before we begin, there's a couple of things I'd like to note. As I've mentioned previously, we do have about 450 people attending today's webinar. So to keep things manageable, everyone's phones will be muted, but there is an option to ask questions throughout if you pop them into the chat box, and then Carl and I will answer them towards the end. So firstly, obviously how to ask a question, it just shows you here on screen. If you do have a question to ask our expert panelist, Carl, please free to drop it in the chat throughout. And I say we'll do the live Q&A at the end of this session this morning. Finally, in terms of the structure, just want to show you quickly with regards to what we're going to be talking about. So an agenda, so the Equality Act, types of discrimination, how to handle them and dealing with discrimination and the consequences of racism. And a Q&A, as I say, at the end of the recording this morning. For a very brief one, for those of you who don't know who MorePay are, I'd just like to very quickly introduce MorePay. In short, we provide payroll and HR software and managed services. We've been around for more than 50 years and we have around 10,000 happy customers across the UK. We promise to make our payroll and HR easy by focusing on 4 key things to our customers. A simple onboarding process, software that's easy to use but that has rich functionality, and flexible services delivered by a team of dedicated payroll services. Again, it's just something to introduce to who MorePay are, but I'll crack on now and I'll introduce our expert panelists for today. So this is Carl. I'd like to introduce him to you all. Carl Hardcastle is one of our employment law consultants here at MorePay. He's got over 10 years experience within, specialising in redundancy, disciplinary, TUPE and wider content employee relations. What I love about Carl is his friendly nature. He's one of our amazing Trustpilot reviews that our customers just can't get enough of him. And you might see him in the office sporting a Hawaiian shirt, which just makes our days on a Friday. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our expert Carl today, and he'll take you through the webinar.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you very much for kind of revealing my my ability to wear a Hawaiian shirt on a Friday in the office.
It's something to be proud of, I'd say, Carl, because not many people can rock it like you can.
Oh, and the checks in the post, Kate. Okay.
Thank you.
First of all, good morning, everybody. Today's webinar, I'm supposed to start off on a high. So hello, thank you for kind of coming in. This is the August webinar from an employment law HR perspective. But I'm really disappointed to be giving this webinar, and the reason is again, you've seen the picture of me, you know my age. This is a topic that is, or should, not is, that should belong in the 1970s and 1980s. But regretfully, it's as live today as it's possibly ever been. Discrimination, race discrimination. And we'll come on to that and in a lot more depth. But before I start, can I just reiterate Kate's point of today we're keen for this to be a two-way exercise. So yes, of course, I've got a lot of PowerPoint slides for you. But what I'm keen to do is get some Q&A at the end of it. If it's something reasonably straightforward, we'll do it live over this webinar. If it's something a little bit more complex, then we can take it off stream and I'll gladly deal with anybody, customers or non-customers, on a one-to-one basis. Okay, the Equality Act. Again, don't worry too much about the law. That's what we're here for. So anything that you see that's case law or anything that you see is actual law, that's what you kind of give us to do and not you. You're there to run your business in an efficient way as you can in very difficult circumstances. We'll sort the rest out. But the Equality Act was brought in 2010, and it was an act that looks at sex, age, religion, sexuality, etc., etc., on the forms of non-discrimination. Now, Kate, if we can just move on a slide, I want to talk to you about the Section 9 bit of the Equality Act. The Equality Act is a huge act. Believe me, we'll be sat here till midnight if I was to take you through the entire lot of it. Don't panic, I am not. But the bit we're focusing on today is the race aspect. Why Is it timely? Well, regretfully, we've all seen the issues with the footballers at the Euro finals. We've all seen issues surrounding the Brexit. And again, I'm not pro or anti-Brexit. What I am saying is that there's racism has seen an influence in the workplace. And of course, thirdly, what we are seeing is just a general problem that's underlying in society. So we thought that, again, regretfully, but we are where we are, it's something that we're going to have a look on in today's webinar. So the Equality Act 2010, Section 9, race. Okay, I'm not going to read out a load of law today, so that's the good news for you all. What I am going to do is talk around these slides. These slides will be available, so I'm not going to read them through, but they'll be there for a good resource. Likewise, there'll be a recording of this webinar available for you too. But the Equality Act, Section 9, race. Race includes obvious things: colour, black, white, okay. Nationality, ethnic or national origins. So it is basically anything that identifies somebody through their race. I'm not going to read that slide, so that's the good news. What I am going to say is race is very, very subtle. Don't automatically assume that, oh, hang on a minute, we've got 3 Asians, therefore we've got to tiptoe around them because they're Asian. It isn't. You need to work out if your problems, but ultimately everybody's the same. But the Equality Act Section 9 does actually identify what race is. If you've got any questions around that, again, please ask them a little bit later on. We're going to go into quite more depth about what discrimination is and how to identify it and how to overcome it. But there's often little quirky things there. You've seen there the definition in front of you of race. There's a famous bit of case law where a Sheffield United fan advertised a job in the Sheffield papers and said Sheffield Wednesday fans need not apply because they were the other half of the city. Somebody brought a case against them and it failed on the grounds of it doesn't matter what race you are, you can be a Sheffield Wednesday fan or a Sheffield United fan. So it can be a little bit counterintuitive, but we'll come on to that a little bit later. So that is a definition of race. It's fairly obvious. It's there to read, but also it can be a little bit more subtle than that. And if we could move on to the next slide, which is caste. Okay, as you can see from this slide, race is very delicate in so much as that you can be Hindu, you can be Indian, and you will have a caste. And again, I'm sure I'm doing this rather clumsily, but you can be high caste, medium caste, or low caste. And does the discrimination work against that? Well, again, I'm not going to work through this slide, but potentially yes. It will look at the intricacies of somebody's race. So just because somebody identifies as a Hindu or as an Indian or as a Canadian or whoever, as you as HR professionals, you need to be constantly on your monitor to work out if it's something more subtle than just a case of, well, they're black, white, Jewish, Muslim, atheist, whatever. So again, please keep your ears open for anybody that says, I'm being treated differently. It may not be as obvious on the first pass, but when you look into it, it could well be obvious. Okay, Kik, can we go on to the next slide? I want to talk about types of discrimination. Discrimination is not always obvious. Of course, there's parts of it that are obvious. If you put a sign up in your window saying we're recruiting a waitress and we don't want any African people, any Asian people, then that's fairly obvious. That's direct discrimination. So if you can come on to the direct discrimination slide, please, Kate. Thank you. Direct discrimination is the sort of discrimination that I've just mentioned. An employment tribunal and I will come on to the employment tribunals, because ultimately that's where cases are heard, and that's where the pain is felt if your organisation has been deemed to be racially offensive. The direct discrimination is fairly straightforward. Where you believe or recruit or take precedence over one race over another. Okay, you'll see at the bottom of direct discrimination there, halfway down your page, a bit of case law. The good news is today I'm not going to talk about case law. I am aware when I mention case law that roughly about half the people listening will disappear immediately. I agree, it's boring, but it's also important. Never get stuck with me in a corner at a party, because I'll bore you to death. But case law is not about today. These are points in principle. If you want to speak to me after the event, I can chat through any particular points. But direct discrimination is either recruiting or taking the word of one person of a particular race above another. So if you've two people at work that's fallen out, you've a Polish person and you've a Spanish person, and you take the Polish person's word more seriously, then the Spaniard is probably going to say that you've been directly discriminatory towards me. I'd like to think this stuff has died out, and I emphasise I'd like to think, but regretfully at Morpay on the advice line, we do occasionally see it. So it's important that you take a very strong line on your policies and practices to make sure that everybody's treated equally. It's fairly obvious. The keys in the name of the Equality Act, i.e. equal, so no direct discrimination. But what I'd like to do is spend quite a bit of time on indirect discrimination. People out there saying, well, what do you mean we do not inwardly indirect discriminate against our employees? And the answer is you may do, but it may be an unconscious bias. There's a famous case a few years ago now of a certain airline, I won't name, but certainly airline ran a recruitment advert for stewards or stewardesses. Not bothered, either one could apply to us, but they ran that advert in a ladies' magazine called Vogue. I'm sure you're all aware of it. Not a personal subscriber, but nevertheless, so a disproportionate amount of women would read that magazine than men would read that magazine. So although they weren't being overtly kind of discriminatory, what they were doing is putting their advert for a job recruitment exercise in a place where disproportionately more women than men would see that. Well, I know what you're going to say. Well, it's not about sex discrimination today. Well, it's the same principle. If you ask your Christian priest to read out a vacancy, or you ask your kind of Muslim imam, then the same thing's going to happen. You've got to make sure that not only when you're recruiting, but when you're employing, your message is consistent and available to all. So direct discrimination is being just that. I don't like you because of X. And indirect can be a lot more subtle. So you need to go have a look at your policies. You need to go have a look at how you communicate with your staff, how you communicate with your suppliers. I'll come on to that in a short while, to make sure that you're being consistent and your information is available to everybody. Okay, let's move on to how we handle discrimination in the workplace and how we actually can discriminate in certain circumstances. So if we could just move the slide on, please, Kate. Okay, so we've identified what types of discrimination are out there, but a tribunal will also look at what we've done with that discrimination. So you may have treated somebody, or hopefully you haven't, may have treated somebody less favourably on the grounds of their race or their perceived race. Doesn't actually have to be so. And the first one is fairly obvious. It's harassment, where you feel humiliated, offended and degraded on the grounds of their race. Why it's important and why I'm mentioning this today, because it's an uncapped award at the tribunal. It doesn't matter if you're an SME with a turnover of 250 grand, or you are a major multiple with turnover of billions, a tribunal judge will not look at your means to pay, they will look at the offence. So if you like, it's not means tested. So if you've harassed your staff due to their race, that's the trigger for tribunal. They can still be in employment while taking you to tribunal. It's a popular myth that somebody has to leave your business to take your business to tribunal. It's not the case. So if you get a complaint of racial harassment, it's very important you take it very seriously, very quickly. Again, if you are clients of us, and hopefully the majority of these people listening are, call our advice line 24/7, 365. We offer, as you're no doubt aware, because your clients, indemnity insurance. So if we advise and it goes wrong, then it's your insurance that pays out at tribunal. If you're not clients of ours, clearly I'm biased, so I'm going to say become clients of ours. But if you're not clients of ours and have no intention to become clients of ours, the first slight whiff you get of harassment, race harassment, please take some professional advice quickly. It can be, I personally, I've seen businesses go under because of the tribunal award that can be tens, if not hundreds of thousands. Harassment will be the first crime, if you want to use a better phrase, labelled against you. The second word you'll see on that slide in front of you is victimization. People don't understand what the word victimization means. Your staff will say to you, I've done X, Y, and Z, and now I'm being victimized. Victimized becomes after the initial offence. Okay? So if somebody says I've been treated less favourably than my race, that's the harassment. Okay? If somebody says I am continually being treated worse by my race, I am being harassed and I have brought it to your attention. So this is why I'm saying that you need to get on any claims of racial harassment or indeed any other harassment quickly, because it escalates rather quickly. So a simple case of racial harassment, a name calling, somebody not getting promotion, somebody not passing the probation, and it's not happened because I'm black, white, Asian, Jewish, whatever, then it quickly escalates into victimization. So it gets very serious very quickly. Okay, let's move on if we make it. Okay, I mean, clearly, the slides in front of you, how do we handle discrimination in the workplace? I've mentioned in the previous slides, we can identify it, and with due respect, that's the easiest bit to do. Somebody says, and a manager says to you, I have a problem. Somebody's claiming that they didn't get promotion because they were Polish or whatever it may be. And before we move on, I just want to point out to the nerds, and I include myself very firmly in that frame, your company is liable for race claims, but also your managers are individually liable for any discrimination that they've done. So if your manager is racist, then yes, of course, the business is liable. We all know about that. But also your manager can be personally be liable to the tune of £5,000 for being racist in the workplace. And for ultra nerds, that comes under Section 109 and Section 110 of the Equality Act. So as a business, you've got responsibility, but your managers have responsibility. Okay, let's look at how to handle discrimination in the workplace. Thanks, Kate. Okay, I'm going to do something a little bit counterintuitive. You can, in very certain circumstances, be racially discriminatory. I'm not going to read through that slide. That's for you to do in your own time. But if you have a certain situation where you absolutely have to have somebody with a certain racial profile in a job, it can be lawful. If you just think about discrimination, I'm going to widen it out, not just to race discrimination. If you put on a production of the musical Annie, and Annie is played by a 49-year-old 6'3" male, you're going to struggle for a little bit. There is certain circumstances where it's a genuine occupational requirement for somebody to look a certain way. it can be done. But it's fair to say these circumstances are very, very, very much in the minority. As 99.9% of the time, you should be employing people on their ability to do their job and not on anything that could be considered racial. But in certain circumstances, it could be the case. But again, don't take a risk. If you're clients of ours, give us a call. If you're not clients of ours and you wish to make a certain decision based on race, then what I would suggest you do is take some professional advice rather quickly, because it can be very, very costly. I'll come on to the cost shortly, but again, I'm not wishing to put the fear in you, but tribunals, quite rightly, take racial discrimination very, very seriously. Okay, let's have a look now, Kate, if we can move on, about dealing with discrimination. I'm going to break my own rule here because I'm going to read through this slide. The reason I'm doing that is because this is, if there's one takeaway from this slide, from this presentation, this is this slide. First of all, approach the issue with an open, objective mind, gain a deep understanding of the complaint and/or issue. It is no excuse to say, I was too busy, I was with an important customer. You guys listening as HR professionals or SME owners, there is never, ever an excuse to say, somebody claimed that they were being racially discriminated against and I put it 6 on my list thing to do. No, it goes number 1. Number 2, could the issue complaint be considered race discrimination? We need to work out what it is. Is it direct discrimination? Have they been denied a promotion? Have they been denied gaining a certain contract because of their race? Is it subtle than that? Is it indirect? Is it because they typically go to church on Sunday? White people, again, indirect discrimination, are more proportionally Christian than, say, Asian people who are more proportionally Muslim. So again, you need to look into the background. I know what you're going to say, kind of white people, Asian people, you, Carl, are being kind of hoisted by your own petard. We're not. We're looking behind the initial complaint. Is there anything there that leads them that indirectly they could have been discriminated against? Likewise, we need to find out what harassment is, and likewise, we need to find out what the victimization is. Number 3, investigate and gather evidence. Clearly, that's obvious. You're doing that for 2 reasons. The first reason you're doing it is because it's the right thing to do. If somebody's complaining that they're being racially harassed, then you need to investigate and investigate thoroughly. That's the first and most obvious reason. There is a secondary reason, and that's because you're doing it for the judge. In the event things go south, in the event that you end up in tribunal, work on the principle, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So if you are in a nasty tribunal race case, what you need to be doing is putting before the judge your thorough investigation notes, your interview notes, your statement notes. It's the right thing to do, of course, but also it's evidence for a potential law case, and that's the last thing you want. Okay, likewise with number 4, there's 2 reasons for doing this. Take the appropriate action, disciplinary, including dismissal or whatever. Yep, that's the right thing to do. Morally, it's the right thing, but again, I'm coming back to the same point. If you're taken to tribunal, if you find out that one of your managers has been discriminatory, if you've not taken strong action against that point, then the judge may work out the principle that you've been involved. You know you have a racist manager, and quote unquote, you've done nothing about it. What does that tell me about your business? So again, you're doing it because it's the right reason. You've got to give natural justice, but also in the event of litigation, you need to evidence the point that you've taken it seriously and you've dealt with it at the appropriate level. And point 5, just before we move on, point 5, don't get overexcited. Somebody says, I've been racially discriminated against. That's one of the easiest things in the world to say. It needs an objective, sound, logical look at it. Be rational, consider the evidence. If you automatically assume, when you go from the standpoint of they have been racially discriminated against, then that's a dangerous point. Start with a balanced view, start with an open mind, and see where that takes you. Okay, if we can just move on to the next slide. Sorry for reading through that slide. It's not normally what I do, because they're there as a resource. But I think it's important to mention those points, so you can identify racism, you can investigate with racism, and you can deal with racism. Okay, a lot of people, have we seen from the England footballers' tweets that have been racially discriminated, a lot of your staff assume that their behaviour is none of your concern at the office door or the factory gate. It is not. If your staff are dealing with racism outside of work, it is very much your responsibility. So if we can just move on, please, to the next slide. There's been a lot of high-profile cases recently. I'm not going to read through the slide again. I've given you that pain once. I won't do it again. But there's been a lot of things in the press about people that have been racist on Twitter, Instagram, to footballers. There was a Danny Baker thing. There's always some celebrity that gets racially abused if they say or do something after the Olympics. It will affect your brand. If you've got an employee that is being racist on Twitter, on Facebook, or whichever social media is there like, and they can be identified to you, you have very much a legal obligation to do something about it. So if your jurisdiction thinks that it stops at the office door, it does not. If you've got staff that are tweeting or sending anything offensive, even in their own time, and you can be identified back with it, again, that may well be gross misconduct. So I'm not suggesting you stalk your employees, not for a second. What I am suggesting is you keep your radar open, that if any of your staff, any of your managers, any of your suppliers are pushing anything out there that could be deemed as racist, then you deal with it immediately. Likewise, if your clients are ours, then give us a call. That's more than important. Okay, so, you know, responsibility, gone are the old days where once somebody left the factory, it wasn't your problem. It is now. So please, I'm not suggesting you witch hunt, but please keep a little eye on what happens and what the impacts could be on your company, your brand, and your standing in society. Okay, Kate, let's quickly move on. I appreciate I've got one eye on the clock. Okay, when to take action. If you've found a racist social media post or something like that, first thing to do is screenshot it. The second an employee knows that you've observed something racist, they will delete. So first thing to do is screenshot it. And the second thing is get ready for the defense, and we hear it all the time, my account has been hacked. Well, who do that? Why would they do that? It makes no sense. Come and tell me more about it. But some key points to have a look at this slide is, does the employee's profile identify them as working for the employer? A lot of people listening today, I'm aware, will be on Facebook and things like that. And one of the first questions it asks is, who do you work for? So if I, and I never would, by the way, but if I, in my Facebook profile or my other media profile, put Cal Hardcastle Morpay and then say something racist, there is a clear link back to me. There's a clear link back to Morpay. And believe me, Morpay would take a very firm stance on that, and I'd suggest you do the same. So if somebody put something, I'll be polite and call it insensitive, is there a route back to your business? Have they identified themselves either via their name, or are they wearing a company shirt on one of their photographs on the profile, or have they named you as an employer? We need to take action, because all of a sudden, that's your many years of hard work building up your business potentially gone in a heartbeat. Okay, the second thing that we need to look at is, what is the actual harm? If somebody's put something mildly offensive, and you've got to go digging for a long while to find out that they're connected to your business, then is there really any harm? Again, it's a case-by-case basis, but I'll leave that with you. And likewise, the people that have seen the post. If you've got a racial abusive post, but that's seen by 5 million people, then it's almost certainly gross misconduct. So you've just got to weigh up where the damage is and what's the strength of the damage. And again, I've said this before, and I will say it again to labour a point. You've got to do it because it's the right thing to do, but also you've got to do it because you're building your case for tribunal. Hopefully you'll never get there, but you need to justify to a judge why somebody saying something was not just, and I'll come on to the banter defence, and by the way, the banter defence always fails, but why it wasn't just quote unquote banter, but why it has genuine damage to your business. Finally, on this slide, just before we move on, you've got to have a clear policy in place. Certain things like direct racism, then technically you do, but you can justify to a judge why you wouldn't have a hardline racist working for you. But you need to have a social media policy. You need to point out to your staff what they should and should not be tweeting, within certain limits, of course. And likewise, if you're a client of ours and using your handbook, there will be a heavy section in your policies, in your handbook, about social media. It's a vitally important thing to do. A lot of people are really nice inside work, but once 5 o'clock Friday comes and they've had a few cans of beer, they turn into rather different people. So it's important that you look at them in work, but keep them on the radar to make sure they're not doing anything they shouldn't be doing outside of work. Okay, let's click it on a slide. Okay, right. So we've identified what racism looks like. I appreciate it's been a little bit of a whistle stop this morning, but again, the slides are there for review. We've identified types of discrimination. We've identified that there's indirect, which is the more subtle of discrimination. We've identified of how to deal with it, and we've talked about disciplinary action, and we've talked about natural justice of gross misconduct, and we've also talked about need to build your case for a tribunal. But the consequences for getting it wrong, I promise you, are not worth thinking about. So we'll whiz over this slide, but I do need to point it out. Recently, there's been an award for £1 million. The case is there if you want to look it up. So an employer has been fined £1 million by a tribunal judge. I appreciate in that case it's an NHS trust, so they've possibly got access to serious funds. But I'll just reiterate what I said at the top of this webinar. It doesn't come down to on your ability to pay it. So if you say, well, I run a small shop, my turnover's £100,000 and I've 1 member of staff, it doesn't matter. The award is absolute. Second point, the other consequence is adverse publicity. Do you really want your name in the headlines of the local paper, splashed all over Facebook and the new media, explaining that you've been lost in court because you're racist? Okay. And the third point is, and before I come on to the third point, let me just nip back to the overall point, is you will have tribunal costs. Lawyers are not cheap to run. You'll have the award and you'll have your own costs. Even if you lose and you've acted reasonably, you will have your own costs. It's not like what you see on television where the other side pays the costs. In tribunal, you pay your own costs. So even if you've been potentially discriminatory, you go to tribunal and win, you will still be paying your own legal fees. And that can be, believe me, quite expensive, as I'm sure you'll agree. Okay, the third point, and this is possibly the most popular point. If you have behaviours, if you have members of your staff that could, emphasise the word could, be discriminatory, you will spend all of your time on grievances, litigation, absenteeism, unhappy workforce, etc., etc., etc. If your policies are fair and equal to everybody, then don't get me wrong, yes, staff will fall out with each other, staff will fall out with you, that's just life, but it'll be kept to a minimum. So the consequence is quite serious. From £1 million tribunal payout, bear in mind £1 million is not the highest I've seen. That's just the recent one. There was one a good few years ago that was 4.4 million. So you really don't want to be going there. So yeah, extreme circumstances. millions of pounds paid out. Local circumstances where you're spending a lot of your time dealing with hassle you don't need to do. There's been a lot of bad feeling around Brexit, a lot of bad feeling about foreign nationals. Just stamp it out immediately, get it on it immediately, and nip it in the bud. Okay, if I can just move on to the next slide, please. Okay, there's nothing on this slide that's going to give you any surprises, but let me just chat through it. First of all, take reasonable steps to ensure discrimination does not occur. Fairly obvious, but again, you need to evidence it. Again, robust policies on the second point. What have you got for your reporting procedures if anybody's claiming racism? Encourage the grievance at the first opportunity. Likewise, all of your policies and procedures do not indirectly discriminate. We've seen this quite a little bit at the moment. I'm sure listeners have got some staff that are from Europe that are applying for settled status. We're seeing a lot of people saying, hang on a minute, you've asked me repeatedly for my settled status. You wouldn't ask a UK national that. You're harassing me, and you're harassing me because I'm Polish, because a UK national could not have European settled status. So just make sure that your policies, I'm sure, are not directly discriminatory, but even if they're indirectly discriminatory, if you're pestering your settled status people for evidence, at some point that becomes you carrying out a statutory duty, which is the correct thing to do. But another point is you may be picking on your Portuguese, Spanish, German, Polish nationals. Which one is it? And again, indirect discrimination is far subtle and not easy to spot. Likewise, regular equality and diversity training for all staff members. There's two reasons you're doing that. The first reason, and I know I sound like a stuck record, and some people out there may remember what a stuck record sound like, and I'm again showing my age. You're doing it because it's the right thing to do. You need to be promoting equality, you need to be promoting diversity of staff. As a business, you need the best out of all of your staff, irrespective of their race. But the second reason you're doing is in the event that you are found to be racially discriminatory in tribunal, a judge will have a look at what is your equality and diversity training like. They are now allowed to actually look into your business and try and work out if you have a policy, training and procedures that will define you as a business. Okay, so just being silent on it may mean that you condone racism. Quite an extreme, but believe me, I've seen it happen. Okay, the other point I'm coming down to now is the banter. The banter defence will always, always, always fail in tribunal. Somebody's banter is somebody else's discrimination. So just make sure that when people say it was just a bit of banter, that you actually take it seriously and look at the language used and look at the intent used. Just saying I was trying to pull his leg will, if excuse the pun about pulling legs, will not stand up in tribunal. Okay, the penultimate point there is deal with complaints regarding discrimination. Do not allow it to fester. If you've got a slight problem, get on it immediately. Don't let it to, well, it'll be all right. I'll put it off well next week. Well, I sort out X, Y, and Z. You need to deal with it immediately. You've seen the reasons why you need to deal with it immediately. It can be potentially business, certainly business damaging, even business ending for your business. And the final point, clearly for our clients, seek professional advice and guidance at all times from us. I will say it again, please be a client of ours if you're not a client of ours. But if you're not a client of ours and you have something that's potentially very nasty, get some professional legal advice as quick as possible. Okay, let's look on to mitigation. Okay, if we can just move on to the next slide. So just before we get on to questions, and again, just to reiterate what I said at the top of this meeting, hopefully you'll have a chance to put something in the chat box and answer them to us. But go over the final points of just to take it very, very seriously, very, very quickly. Racism can be quite subtle. Don't think that you do not discriminate because you get the best person for the job. The problem's ended. It hasn't. Have a look at your policies. Have a look at your procedures. And again, the first time you get a whiff of trouble, If you're clients of ours, please call us. And if you're not clients of ours, please be clients of ours. But if you're not clients, get some professional advice. I'm not trying to drum up trade, I promise you. Things can get rather serious very quickly. So thanks for your attention. I'm going to hand you back now to Kate. And any questions? Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Carl. So now for some of the questions that have been coming through. I'll start from the top and we'll work our way through if that's okay. So one of the questions came in at the start was kind of, have you got any recommendations on how someone could develop maybe an anti-racism policy and implementing it within a small charity?
Yeah, likewise, as I said previously, even though you are a charity, a tribunal will not look at that. They will say, well, third sector, we'll let you off. It doesn't work that way. If you're a charity, a small charity, or if you're a big Microsoft or Apple business, the tribunal will look at a race claim the exactly same. What you need to do is in your policies, in your handbook, and again, we can help with that, is to point out what you consider acceptable and non-acceptable behaviours, how we address each other, how we treat each other, have we got a diversity and inclusivity policy. But what also we'd look to do is have a regular training session once a year for your staff to work out that what they should be doing in the correct order when it comes to dealing with their colleagues. You're doing that for two reasons. The first reason, as I said previously, it's the right thing to do. And the second reason, in the event that your charity is in tribunal, then you will have a statutory defence of, look at our training records. We did all that we could.
Brilliant, thank you. And the next one goes back to the start when someone's put, does harassment cover all equalities, not just race?
It does indeed. Very good question. Young, old, black, white, straight, gay, married, sex, sexuality, harassment. Once somebody has highlighted that they have suffered a detriment due to their protected characteristic, and that's me with my anorak on, by the way, anything beyond that is harassment. Is victimization beyond the harassment. So effectively, you're making the situation worse for the business and not better. But yeah, 10 out of 10. All the protected characteristics can be harassment as well as then victimization if it continues.
Perfect. And then someone's put, does the person who's been discriminated against or feel they need to provide that evidence to you or to their line manager?
First of all, if it's the line manager and the line manager is racially harassing them, then the line manager is not the person to be hearing that. Yes, we encourage employees to give all evidence that they've got. Clearly, we need to do that. But the peculiar thing about race harassment, race victimization, racial discrimination in tribunal is the proof for the judge is reversed out. You go for unfair dismissal. My employer sacked me and it was unfair. The judge sits there in his mind thinking, okay, employee, tell me why it wasn't. If you go for any of the protected characteristics but race discrimination in this circumstances, the judge works on the principle of starting off with, you have been dismissed due to your race, and it's your employer that has to persuade the judge otherwise. So yes, as much evidence as possible. The employee should give us all the evidence they have, but that's not enough. We need to go and get into the background of the case, interview witnesses, effectively prepare the tribunal bundle as part of the investigation into the discrimination claim.
Lovely, thank you. And then we've got quite a few coming through with regards to social media. Now this question was asked, but I think you've probably covered it anyway, but it'd be nice just to have a quick recap. So they've put, what do you do if an employee has expressed a racist view on social media and a complaint is received by another member of staff who's seen the post?
Yeah, we may, again, it's all a case by case basis, but we may have reached the threshold for gross misconduct. Your staff have an obligation to your business outside of work as they have inside of work. If you have a complaint by a member of staff that another member of staff is posting racist views, you have a duty of care to the person that's offended, and also you have a duty of care to your own business. So after fair procedure, you may well end up dismissing them for gross misconduct. If you're a client of ours, please give me a call.
Lovely. And then someone's, but obviously you mentioned that you shouldn't be snooping or spying on your employees, but is there any recommendations that you could think with regards to maybe monitoring staff for potential posts or on social media without it being a, big brother feeling?
Yeah, as I said previously, and I'll say it again, please don't stalk your staff. That's not what you're about. But if you have a policy of saying, look, we expect you to work to these standards, and these include not sending racial discriminatory texts or emails or Instagrams or whatever, and if you have a light touch, or alternatively something is brought to your attention. One of my favourite bugbears is when somebody says something racist over Facebook, an employee gets to find out about it, and the first thing the employee says, hang on a minute, that's private. Well, no, it's not. It's printed out and it's on my desk. That's not very private, is it? So I'd suggest a light touch. I wouldn't suggest that you sit and stalk your employees, but if anything's brought to your attention, if anything is immediately obvious to your business, and your business is named or kind of hashtagged in or whatever the youth say nowadays, it's very much your business.
Brilliant. And then someone's asked with regards to what approach would you suggest taking when someone has potentially sent a racist message on a private work chat, so on Teams or Slack, an internal messaging system?
Yeah, there's no such thing as private. As I said, kind of just a little bit previously, if you know you have a racist employee or an employee saying racist things, you cannot unsee it. So if their defence is, well, it was over Teams, it was over a WhatsApp group, it doesn't matter. If you have a racist employee or an employee that's been racist, you have to deal with it appropriately. And the defence of it's private, regretfully for them, doesn't fly.
Brilliant. So someone's put, you talked about obviously being identifiable on social media when someone's posted something, but this question is if they don't identify themselves as an employee in an organisation anyway, and through posts, photos, etc., does this prevent the employer taking any action? For example, if someone was to make a complaint as they knew the employee worked through another source, but not because it was available on their actual profile themselves?
Indeed, it'll be treated on a case-by-case basis. If there's no photograph of the employee there, there's no details of your organisation, and there's no link back, then you're going to struggle. But it still doesn't stop you from addressing it. It still doesn't stop you from investigating. I don't want to use the word pressure, that's the wrong word, but you need to investigate with your employee. And once they know it's unacceptable, or you're on to them, for want of a better phrase, you'll find out posts get mysteriously deleted. But yes, there's got to be a clear link back to your business. But even if there isn't a clear link, you can certainly ask some questions.
Brilliant. And then someone just asked another question with regards to they've had a situation with regards to banter, racism. Again, what's the best process for that? Because you've talked about it, but again, just to reaffirm, that would be great, Carl.
Okay, no problems. I've said it halfway through this webinar, and I'll say it again because it's an important point to make. The banter defence always fails in tribunal. If you go to a tribunal, and that's ultimately where things end up, and your defence was it was a bit of workshop banter, it will fail. Somebody's banter is somebody else's racism, is somebody else's misogyny, homophobic comments, etc., etc. Workplace banter, and again I hate using that word, but banter has got to be within certain parameters. Yes, you can say somebody's got some dodgy hair, or somebody's not wearing the correct brand of watch or whatever. That's perfectly acceptable. Once we step into the Equality Act, once we step into racism, banter will not, that is not a defence, I promise you.
Good. And then someone's put, regarding regarding investigations, what would you suggest in a he said, she said situation where one employee reports direct or indirect discrimination, but there's no evidence to prove that?
That is a very good question, and that's the paradox. Because if you've got a black person or a white person being racially harassed, and it's one versus one person, then do you believe the white person, the black person, the Polish person, the Scottish person? It'll probably fizzle out to nothing. But what I would suggest, if you do have that situation, you have some mediation, and you point out that racism, and you're not accusing of racism because we've no clear evidence, one person's word against another, but you point out it will not be tolerated, If there's any repeat, we'll have another look at it, but we have some way of working, and that's how we address each other. That's the language we use, and we always work in a professional way. So if you've no clear evidence in any direction, you may well just want to mediate yourself out that situation. And again, evidence it in the event it escalates, and you can point to your notes, you can point to the statements, and said that we treated it as strongly as we could have done in the circumstance.
Brilliant. And we just got one final question. So they've asked, how do you deal with a complaint from a third party who says that he heard a manager make a racist comment about another member of staff, and then they've mentioned that the member of staff doesn't want to put it in writing, and the person who the racist comment was supposedly made about is not aware of it and usually gets on well with that manager?
Then again, we've got that catch-22. If your supplier is upset by racism strongly enough to mention it to you, then they should be putting it in writing. If they're not prepared to put it in writing, then possibly we don't have a very strong case. What I would do is, again, go back to my point of check your policies, check your procedures, check your training. Has that member of staff had some equality and diversity training recently? You might want to hint at that member of staff of what they've done, but regretfully, if you've no evidence and can't get any evidence, you've nothing to show the judge. So it's going to peter out to nothing.
Fair enough, that makes sense. And then we just have one that will pop in. Is hair or hair texture a protected characteristic?
Again, an excellent question. First of all, thank you. We run these webinars often, and at the end of them, you never know what questions you're going to get. And sometimes they're fantastic, and sometimes brilliant and average. Today's been in the former category, been some excellent questions. The answer to your question is yes. This is yet to be seen in case law, but of people of Afro-Caribbean descent, does your dress policy take into account their heritage? And the answer is, if it doesn't, then you need to adjust your policies, because it can be, again, indirectly discriminatory. It's not obvious. You're saying that we want all hair in a ponytail, or all hair cropped, or all hair whatever. If somebody is typically Afro-Caribbean, but doesn't have to be always, is their hairstyle appropriate for the workplace? And if the answer is yes, then you should allow it, if there's no health and safety issues.
Brilliant, and that's everything today. So, Carl, before we wrap up, I'd just like to say thank you. We've answered all the questions, and I hope everybody's got everything out of it today. So I really appreciate you taking the time out today, Carl. It's been really interesting.
No, it's good to speak to you again, Kate, and it's good to speak to our wonderful listeners.
Good stuff, I must admit. I've enjoyed it, found some really interesting stuff, so I do appreciate it, and I'm sure the audience do as well. I just wanted to, before I wrap things up, point in the direction of our knowledge centre. So for anyone that hasn't had the luxury of speaking to Carl and one of our customers, please, there's some really good information on there which would help with regards to employment law, HR consultancy, and any payroll queries that you might have. But as I say, feel free to have a look at that. You'll find things like our employment law guide, which will have bits and pieces in there, and we also publish this on social media. As I say, I found it really useful today. I hope you guys have. We will be sending recording of the webinar and the slides later on today for you. But there's no more questions. Again, I'd like to say another thank you to Carl, and I'll close the webinar today.